Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar. I've got here Naomi today from Wezen, who is their UK merchant manager, who has joined me in this webinar to discuss automated versus human translations and how they can help you with your translation projects in the future. How do you think automated translations are perceived nowadays in comparison to where they were, for example, 5 to 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question when we're dealing with deciding to start translating your content at the moment, because I think automated translations are definitely a big part of that conversation. I think a few years ago when it was just starting, people were excited about it, but it didn't really live up to expectations. So I think a lot of people who attempted to use machine translation a few years ago really got burned by it because it affected their brand image, because the quality just wasn't there. But also back then it was based on language rules trying to explain what a language is supposed to do. And now it's much more based on machine learning. So once the machine has seen certain sentences over and over again, it gets much better at the kind of content that it can produce in those languages. So it's definitely something that is on the table now. It's definitely for certain types of content, something that is of a high enough quality to start using. And it's a very big cost saver when you're thinking about translating your content.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I've back in my sort of, work history, I've obviously custom translated stuff for websites in different countries, and I can definitely tell when back in the day when I saw competitors using automated translations, which were I found very damaging for when they used them, and from what is possible now with different integrations and platforms you can choose from. I think it's very, very different, and I think it's come a long way. But yeah, let's discuss whether we think this will ever replace one or the other. We can come to that later. I think it would be really good to know if, just to talk about a bit about Wezen, what do you do? What do you offer? Just maybe start with that first.
Okay, yeah, so Wezen is a tool that would support you when you're going on your translation journey. So often these tools are used within translation agencies themselves, but we're seeing more and more that companies want to bring those translations in-house and start to manage the content themselves. So just like you would use a word processor if you wanted to write an article, it's really helpful to have the right tools to support you in translation, and that's what Wezen is and what it does. So basically you would upload your content onto Wezen, and then Wezen has certain tools built in it, like the ability to store a translation memory, the ability to have your keywords added on into a term base to make sure that you're hitting international SEO. And you can have both your source content next to your translation so that your translators, if you're using humans, can see what the context is of their translations. They don't have to keep switching from one page to another. So they're some of the kind of fundamental support tools that you get within Wezen to help your translations be a bit more of a high quality, make more sense, have control more over your tone of voice. So we would recommend using a tool to do your translations, just so you can have a bit more of a control over these things, as opposed to just seeing if someone can do it in a Word document and then send it over to you. Also, another great reason to use a tool is for formatting and HTML purposes. You can keep hold of the structure of your source into your translations. So when you upload it onto your translated site, you're much more likely to get the same layout. Layout can be a really huge issue when you're translating on documents that don't have the backup of the original HTML. So there are some reasons that you would choose a tool, and that's some of the things that Wezen offers within the tool itself.
That sounds good. I mean, we talked about some of the bits. I think what I've also read about is people really using more as the workflow, and whether Wezen would offer customizable workflows, because obviously certain teams work in certain ways and so on and so forth. So whether that's possible with your platform.
Yeah, and this is something that we've seen more and more. When we first started, we had a really structured workflow because we just didn't see the scope of how complex this can become. But now, yeah, it's fully customizable. So we have even specific departmental departmentalized parts of the workflow. So for example, if you have if you're dealing with safety wear and it's really important that legally things are correct because otherwise you might have liability issues, then we can add on a legal step in the workflow. So that is specifically for a legal team to go in and check that content. Same with SEO. We found that a lot of people were translating their content, then they were extracting it from their translation agency or from the tool that they were using, sending it off to an SEO agency that was outside of their business, getting them to verify it. Then they would have to re-upload it onto the translation tool to make edits. So this was really complex. So two things alongside that, we've created an SEO step if you want to have an agency check within Wezen, and we've opened Wezen up. So there's no restrictions as to who you onboard for your project. It doesn't have to just be internal in your company. If you have an external legal team, if you have an external SEO agency, even if you deal with an external design agency to check formatting and layout for you, all of these people can be joined onto your Wezen project so that you're all working in the same space and you know at what point in the workflow your team has to come on and check the content. We use notifications within the tool for that as well. So trying to make things run smoothly without emails back and forth, losing content, losing formatting, and making sure everybody sees what they need to see.
Yeah, I mean, that's really good. I think the only other thing I would add is we often, obviously languages are different, words have different lengths. If you translate them, they can sometimes massively throw off layouts because, like, you know, for example, German nouns, a noun is can be made up by several nouns, so the word gets incredibly long, which will give you issues on buttons or navigation and that kind of stuff. So always having a front-end developer on board as well to make sure that you can match that, I think that's also really important. And it's great if you can get all those key people involved to just get the, you know, the sign-up process quicker and get the stuff quicker live on your side. I think that's a really good process.
Yeah, definitely. We had so that's something else that comes with these tools is a character count, so your translators can keep an eye on how long the translation is becoming. But like you said, with German, it's the same with Russian. These languages need much more space to convey the same amount as you would in, say, English. So you have to be aware of what the final thing is going to look like. We have the addition of a live preview for some options, which means that you can kind of check as you're going with the translation, which really helps. But yeah, definitely something to bear in mind if you're starting to produce sites in different languages, that there will be times when you just have to say it that way in German. And so you'll have to take into account the extra length of those sentences.
Yeah, that's very good. I think what also plays into that then, and especially looking at German and some of the other languages, obviously in the past when looking at automated translations, they always seem to struggle with context. That was one of the main issues where translations were appearing wrong, or even sometimes a single word was chosen wrong because in that context you would have chosen a different one. For example, in Germany, we have for one thing you want to say, there are 15 possible words you can use for it, and you would use them depending on what you're trying to say differently. So in terms of if your memory function and everything else which Wezen offers, how close are you coming to it understanding context as best as possible?
Yeah, so that's something that we have built into our memory function. So you'll get an indicator in the tool itself. Wezen will say, hey, I've seen this sentence before in English. We've translated it this way into German. So this is what we recommend you do. But it also says it'll have a color-coded bar. And if that color-coded bar is the same color top and bottom, that means that the sentence preceding it and the sentence after it are also the same. So you know that it's kind of sat within that context package, and you can say, oh yeah, this makes sense because I know the context, because the previous sentence and the following sentence are the same as they were before, which means I trust what this memory is saying to me. If the colors are different, if you've got a red and a green, then you know that the previous one is not the same. So you might want to check what that is in the source to make sure that the context matches. And this is the same for being able to, especially if you're dealing with products, being able to see that product as you're making the translation. So we have the ability to add images, and images are key. Like, you don't know what the color of something is. If in certain languages you have several different words for different colors. So you might say, oh, this is a gold something or another, but in Russian, there's several words for gold. So which gold is it? Being able to see images really helps you get those things right. And I think that it's not something you think about if you're just an English speaker and then you send your content away. You just assume that it's going to come back and it'll be fine. But there are so many nuances within the different languages you're translating into that need to be kind of protected against with as much support as you can give it. And that's why we recommend using tools like Wezen for your translation.
That's quite interesting. So a lot of clients more and more think about media translation. So that is not necessarily, translating a video, but for example, if you have translated links, downloads in your text, can they be translated to, obviously, you know what that means, replaced by an actual link which is supposed to be showing this language, or image alt tags, for if we're going into the SEO route, is that something you can help with translating to just improve that as well for merchants?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's such a good point. SEO doesn't stop with your content. It obviously other countries have their own SEO. So it's really important to think about international SEO, and especially like you're saying that your alt text needs to be thought about. Any links need to be thought about too. These will affect your visibility. It's going to affect how your users experience the site in those locales. So when you're thinking about translating, it's not just the words that are describing your product. You have to go all the way. Otherwise, the feeling that your customers get when they're experiencing your website is really clunky and disconnected. So it's really important that you do think about those things that you maybe can't see straight away on the website, but are there in the background, and that do affect your SEO on an international basis. Yeah, it's a really good point.
Yeah, that sounds great. So are there any SEO implications with using Wezen, or you guys have that developed so far that you are happy with what you're providing for merchants and then what at the end the customer can see in return?
Yeah, so as I said, we are happy to work with your SEO agencies if you have them already on your side. But we have a plugin with our term-based solution. So as I mentioned before, you can have a list of your keywords that you want to make sure are hit. So in that term-based solution, we have a SEMRush plugin, and that gives you the score of your international keywords. So you can find out what this word in German has as an SEO score, and you can search and see whether there's a better word and then if you can see a better word, you would add that word to the term base and say this is our preferred German word based on the score that you can see from our SEMrush plugin. So there is that extra support there for your international SEO, because I think if you don't speak the languages, it can feel quite intimidating to try and take these things on. But really, it does make sense, and the tool's there to kind of help you take each step and get those things right as you go.
Yeah, that's correct. I think that also brings us to a good point, such as what merchants need to consider. So from your standpoint, what do you think merchants need to consider when thinking about manual and automated translations, or whichever you want to talk about?
I think, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of getting down into the nitty gritty of it, really. As a merchant, when you're approaching translations, like you might have started to see some traction coming from like the French market, perhaps, and you're like, oh, let's explore this. Maybe we should translate a specific site for them and see where that goes. That's a really great step to take, but there's some things to consider before you dive straight in. And I think fundamentally, you need to think about what's the quality that I need my content to be when it is translated, and what price am I willing to pay for that quality to be achieved. So if you can establish like what your budget is because you expect a certain return once you've entered that market, and what quality you need your content to come across at. So if you're dealing with luxury products, if you're dealing with watches, for example, they're a really good one. You'll need somebody who speaks the language to make sure that the terminology used is accurate in that language. So I would recommend from experience that you need to have at least one human checking that, if not having a human translating it originally and then having human review on top of that, to make sure that the quality of your content in that locale is of a really high standard. Because obviously if it's not of a high standard, that reflects on your product. So if you're selling a luxury product, but you've got a low standard translation, your customers aren't going to believe you when you say, oh, you have to pay X amount for this luxury product. However, if you're selling goods that have like high levels of repetition in their descriptions, that you're using the same colors, you're using the same materials over and over again, that's when you can start to think about using a machine translation or a correlation system. So correlations is when like you might just change the color or a small thing in the description, but most of your products are the same. And then Wezen will see that you've already translated those things, just automatically correlate the things that it's seen before, and you don't pay for those correlations because you've already paid for the translation once. You're only paying for the changes. So that's a really good thing to set up on your when you're thinking about what kind of workflow you want. But then also we've been talking about machine translation. As I say, it's coming on leaps and bounds. It's even doing really great stuff for higher end products, but we still recommend that you have a human check that, because there's certain things a machine can't understand. It has issues around genders, for example. In English, we don't have a gendered-based language, but if you're going into French, then you have masculine, feminine. In German, I believe you've got neutral as well. So there's, yeah. So these kind of things, machines will learn eventually because they kind of see what's matched up and when.
Yeah.
But when you're kicking off, you definitely need a human to be checking those things, because they're fundamental to what the quality looks like. And they're like, I'm sure as a native speaker, you would say, I would be really frustrated if I saw the wrong gendered terms being used, and you just think that that's like a fundamental thing to get right from the off, right? Yeah,
absolutely. I think it's also when talking to merchants and offering them a translation service, or even as a translation agency as such, I think it's very important for them to what are they actually trying to achieve, because like you said, automated translations sometimes are more than sufficient in certain areas for certain products, for certain merchants, and for certain languages, whereas other countries, such for example France, they're very proud of their language, they're very proud of their grammar. I would not recommend going with an automated translations in that country unless you're willing to either review your automated translations with, you know, a human, or even do it from scratch with a person as such. Because I think you don't want to damage your brand, like we said in the start. You want to make sure that if you want to give them that cultural feel of making them feel they're viewing your site in their mother tongue, it needs to be done properly. So I still come across many sites every day where I see translations and I click on them, and obviously I can tell where it's done properly and where it isn't. And I still think that some brands do more harm than good. And it's not about the quantity of having 50 languages to choose from. I'd rather have 2, which are done properly, rather than many. But if you when you go into them and read your product, it actually makes no sense, which is a shame, because then you lose also that trust in the customer. So you try to provide a more cultural feel, yet in it you might have lost this customer because you actually done it the wrong way. I think that's very important, and that can be, you know, like you said, there's many ways you can do this, but I think it really needs reviewing if you want to internationalize. How are you going to do it, and what scale? And I always recommend small steps and doing it properly, rather than just do it all in one go and doing it like half-baked, I would say. That's something I've seen.
Definitely. And I think this leads on really well to when you're, so say, for example, you don't want to do this in-house, so you don't have the kind of control over what's going on at each step. If you are going to deal with a translation agency, make sure you're asking the right questions, and make sure that you get them to run a test on your content so that you can check whether it's hitting the right standards for you. So you can always say, you know what, as part of this kind of decision-making process, we're going to send you some articles. Please send them out. Like, we'll put them through the workflow that we've decided upon, and we want to see what kind of quality we're getting. Then you can get that monitored independently. You could have a different translator outside of your translation agency to check that over. But these things are vital, because I think with a lot of people who are dealing with translation agencies, they put a lot of faith in the agency, and they should do. They should get that support. But there are some fundamental things that you can do at the beginning to make sure that you're getting the standard that you have paid for, and that you expect. and they're like, it's absolutely fine for you to be asking for these things when you're having those conversations.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point to lead on to. From your personal opinion, do you ever think automated translations are going to replace human ones? And I'm just going to give you a couple of things which might give you more food for thought. So, do computers understand sense of humor? Are they creative? And are they, what is their cultural awareness? And based on that, I think, let me know how you feel about that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and there are huge debates going on in the translation community at the moment around things like this. I'm sure that you were privy to that when you were doing translations. I think it really depends on the content and, like you say, the context. At the moment, machines are starting to get better and better for certain types of content, really structured content, repetitive content, content that is trying to convey maybe your brand and tone of voice. Those things can sit well into those structured pieces with a machine because it can learn those things. But for more complex things like articles, opinion pieces, having a human do that work, it means that you'll connect with your audience much better. And taking the risk of using a machine for that means that it might get a couple of paragraphs right, but then it might go completely off the wall, and then you'll lose your audience instantly. So for those more complex pieces, for times when you're trying to genuinely connect with your audience, I really don't think a machine is going to be able to do that for you, and I would not recommend attempting it, really.
In terms of what you're offering for customers, is there sort of different packages you can offer to customers, or would they all go with the same? And do they have to have, certain requirements to be able to use you, or is that for everyone the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think that every single translation project that I've worked on so far has been different. I don't think I can think of one that runs in the same way as even if you had a similar brand that was selling similar items. It really is down to need, budget, kind of time frame of turnaround. There's so many things to think about. I think in order for a merchant to kind of get the right result and the right kind of workflow is to know your volumes. Like, this is key. This is something that comes up time and time again in our conversations. So knowing the volume of your source content, because then from there you'll be able to see how much content you're dealing with, how much is that going to cost me if I deal with humans, and it tends to be on a cost per word basis. So bear that in mind when you're thinking about translating. And obviously, how much is charged per word varies from whether you're dealing with a standard translator, a specialist translator, or you're using machine translation. So that's where you get your fluctuation, and that's what you're looking at. Also, how many rounds of review do you need to have? Are you going to start with human translator, human review? Are you going to also be validating in-house? These are things to be thinking about. What are your needs? What are your quality needs? And what's the price you're willing to pay from it? But volumes are the things that will help you establish what they are. If you have a smaller budget, then I think feeding machine translation in for a first pass is key. That will save you a lot of money. But having a human do the review step is definitely something worth considering. But as I mentioned before, get tests to be run, and then you'll know what kind of quality you're dealing with. And then you can make an assessment from that point onwards.
Well, thank you, Naomi, for joining us today and for all your insights and explanations around Wezen and translation. If you got any interest in what was discussed today, we have an ebook you can download online, and any other questions you will hopefully be answered with anything you can read in the ebook or in other webinars. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.
Bye.